Recently, I made a video that was over 3 hours long, having anything and everything to do with 16th century blackwork embroidery. What needles were used, how to dress a slate frame, what is a slate frame, what thread did they use, where to find the patterns. And so, since that was a very long video, over 3 hours, I did have chapters in it, but to make it easier, I have split that video into multiple videos, and here's one of those videos now. But before we get started, hello, my name is Lynn Fairchild, and welcome to my channel. And to help you with your blackwork embroidery journey, I have books on Amazon. Both of these have patterns in them that would have been found. This one has patterns specifically from the 16th century, whereas this one has patterns from both the 16th and the 17th century. I will have links below in the description. Holbein stitch, which is a double running stitch, also known as blackwork, is named Holbein stitch after Hans Holbein the Younger. Hans Holbein the Younger was an artist in the early 16th century. He became a court painter for King Henry VIII of England, and he was there in the 1520s for a couple of years in England, and then he left, and then he came back, and then from about the mid 1530s on until his death in 1543, he painted portraits in England. And it became this double running stitch, which beforehand had been known as Spanish work, and that was after Catherine of Aragon, who was the first wife of Henry VIII. I do believe that blackwork embroidery existed before Catherine in England, because we know from Geoffrey Chaucer in his tale of the miller's wife, I believe her name was Alice, but Chaucer talks of black embroidery of both alike within and without on a white background, and that sounds exactly like the double running stitch, which is a reversible geometric embroidery that is iconic of early blackwork. And so if Geoffrey Chaucer was discussing that or describing it in his time, then Catherine of Aragon didn't introduce it, but she made it popular. She married Henry VIII in 1509. They immediately, once Henry VII passed away, they immediately got married, and then they had a joint coronation. And so once she made blackwork embroidery popular, it became known as Spanish work. However, then fast forward to the 1530s, where Henry VIII was looking to divorce Catherine so he could marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Spanish work became no longer known as Spanish work, but then became known as blackwork. And then fast forwards to some more time, and this Spanish work that became blackwork also then became known as Holbein stitch, and that's because other artists during this time period in Europe, some may have painted one portrait with blackwork, some might have painted 2 or 3 portraits with blackwork. Hans Holbein the Younger painted a minimum of 30 different portraits. Some of the portraits, we don't have the actual painting still, but we do still have his drawings. So we know of at least 30 different portraits that he drew or he painted that have blackwork embroidery in them. And some of these portraits are so detailed that we can zoom in, for example, on some of his miniatures that are only 5 centimeters in diameter. You can still look at the detail work, see what the pattern is on the collar, and then be able to recreate those patterns and be able to do that exact pattern today if you wanted to do blackwork embroidery. Sadly, some of Hans Holbein the Younger's portraits have been lost to time, mostly due to fires. Well, because we're talking the early 16th century. He was a court painter for Henry VIII from about the mid-1530s until Holbein died in 1543. But we still have the drawings as well as some of his other portraits that have been painted, and I think one of the most famous, popular, however you want to describe it, portraits that he did with blackwork embroidery in it is of King Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. And if you zoom in, like look in at the portrait, you can see her cuffs, and you can just from the naked eye, without even zooming in, you can see the detail work and be able to recreate that pattern. The earliest drawing or portrait I found is this drawing of Anna. It's from around 1525 to 1526. And if you look, she has embroidery on her cuffs and her sleeves, as well as on the upper body part of her dress. And then we go to the Darmstadt Madonna portrait. This is before the Protestant Reformation, and so most of Europe was still wanting a lot of Madonna pictures. It was very much a Catholic continent, I guess, at that point. But the Protestant Reformation was coming into play. But at this time, he was painting Madonnas. And if you look closely, if you look here, you will notice that the lady in the bottom right looks very similar to Anna from the previous portrait. This is the Darmstadt Madonna, was painted in 1526, and the portrait has more details as far as the embroidery. She also has embroidery around her collar as well as on the dress. So much so that here I have enhanced the picture more and color-coded it. So there is the pattern that is in red is the pattern that is right around her elbow. The pattern in blue are the cuffs, and then the pattern in green, that is what is on the body of her dress. And that is one of the things that makes Holbein stand out from other artists at this time, is because his detail work is so intricate that we can see the patterns and recreate the patterns today. Going on into 1528, here is a double portrait of Sir Thomas and his son John. And the son John, you can see right at the collar on the neck, he has blackwork embroidery on the collar there, and I have recreated the pattern that I see on the collar. Here is a portrait of Nicholas Kratzer, also from 1528. When you zoom in, some museums are better about being able to zoom in and seeing the pattern than other museums. This one still comes out a little grainy, but it is at least, you can tell that there is black work there on the edge, aside from the Textile Research Center confirming that the sitter is shown wearing a narrow band of black work on the collar of his shirt. This is a portrait of a noble boy with a marmoset. It's from circa 1532 to 1535. If you did a Google search with this portrait, some websites might list this portrait as being Edward VI, who was the one legitimate son of Henry VIII. That's King Henry VIII of England with the 6 wives. However, some websites might also acknowledge this boy as being Henry Fitzroy, who was Henry VIII's illegitimate son from his mistress, Bessie Blount. Either way, the museum, this portrait is at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, I believe in Vienna. They just have the portrait listed as a noble boy with a marmoset, but if you look in closely, you can actually see the pattern around his collar, and because it's Holbein, the details are intricate, we can actually see what the pattern is, and I have recreated it here. Here is a portrait of a man in royal livery from about 1532 to 1535. If you zoom in on the collar, yes, that is black work in the sense that it is black embroidery on his collar. However, if you notice, this is not iconic of the geometric blackwork embroidery that Holbein is known for. But this is still black silk thread embroidered on the collar. Here is a drawing of Catherine, Duchess of Suffolk, and this is from about 1532 to 1543. Because it is just a drawing, we don't know the exact pattern on the collar, but you can tell by how he has drawn the collar that there is blackwork on her collar around her neck. This is a portrait of Derek Bourne from about 1533, and from the Textile Research Center, Bourne is shown wearing a shirt with a collar band decorated with an intricate knotwork design embroidered in blackwork. And by zooming in on the collar, here is my interpretation of the pattern that is on his collar. Also from about 1533 is Thomas, the 2nd Baron, I believe that's pronounced Vaux? I want to say Vaux. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Again, this is just a drawing. and not the final portrait. There are a lot of portraits of Holbein's that have been lost over the years. Some have been lost. For example, there is a very popular mural of Henry VIII with Jane Seymour, Henry VII, and Elizabeth of York. It was originally painted, I'm trying to remember the name of, I believe it was Whitehall that it was painted at, but there was a fire done in, I believe it was 1678. It was the later part of the 17th century. There was a fire and pretty much everything was destroyed, including the original mural. So we do have a copy of it where another artisan had copied the mural, so we have an idea of what the original looked like, but we don't have the original. And so that's the same case with a lot of portraits where we have drawings still of Holbein's, but we may not have the finished product. We may have copies of it or others that learned from him, so it may have been a student in his tutelage that taught him or him. But anyways, I digress. Here is a drawing of Thomas, and if we zoom in closely on the collar, you can see again with how he drew the collar, we know that there is black work there. I cannot definitely tell what the pattern is. To me, it almost looks like heart shapes that are kind of crisscrossed. So I could kind of guesstimate what the pattern looks like, but we do not know for sure what the pattern looks like because, again, this is just a rough drawing and not the official portrait. Here's a portrait of Robert Cheeseman from about 1533. And if you zoom in closely on his collar, you can see he has just a very simple detail around his collar. And here I have recreated the pattern. This is a court servant of King Henry VIII from about 1534. And this portrait, I put in the diameter just because I find this interesting that the diameter is only 11.8 centimeters, yet Holbein was able to get such intricate detail work into such a small painting. And with that, we can see that it's a very simple black work. As far as black work, there is embroidery there. We can acknowledge there is black thread there doing embroidery, but it is simple up and down black and white stripes with black thread right on the very edge, doing the detail work on the very edge of the fabric of the collar. From about 1535 to 1536 is Margaret Roper, who was formerly Margaret More, one of the daughters of Thomas More, Sir Thomas More. And this one I'm even more impressed with because the last portrait was over 11 centimeters in diameter. This portrait is only 4.5 centimeters in diameter. So even though it is a very small portrait, Hans Holbein the Younger was able to get the detail work so much so that I was able to recreate the pattern that we see in the center part of her collar. This is a portrait of Simon George of Cornwall from roughly 1535 to 1540. The diameter of this portrait is 31 centimeters, and the museum actually provided this information that I thought was neat, where it described how the portrait was required for purposes of courtship, as in indicated by the carnation and the clasp on the beret. So I just found that to be interesting. Here is the infamous portrait of Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was the third wife of Henry VIII, and she was the mother of Edward VI, the only legitimate son of Henry VIII. This portrait is from right around 1536 to 1537. She married Henry VIII in 1536. However, she died shortly after childbirth in 1537. And if you see the zoomed in picture, we can see the pattern that is on her cuffs of her sleeves. And I believe this is why people refer to blackwork as Holbein stitch, is especially from this particular portrait, because from this portrait, if you look, the detail work is phenomenal and we can recreate the pattern, which I've done here on the right. This is Mrs. Jane Small, formerly Mrs. Pemberton, and this is from about 1536, and here I have recreated the pattern on both her collar as well as on her cuffs. And if you look closely on her cuffs, I have two pictures here, because Holbein has been able to show that it is reversible. What is on the front is the same as what you see on the underneath side of her cuffs. The other thing I think is neat is the diameter is only 5.2 centimeters, so this is a very small portrait, but Hans Holbein the Younger, was able to get the detail work very nice, neat. It is gorgeous how we're able to zoom in and look and recreate the patterns. This is a portrait of Henry VIII from about 1537, and from the Textile Research Center, the king is shown wearing a doublet with gold-colored yellow work around the collar and with wide strips of blackwork foliage on the double front and sleeves. However, when I say that, if you look at the doublet front and the sleeves, this is more the swirly, non-geometric type. This is a freehand stitch that is more iconic of the later 16th century, especially when you go into Queen Elizabeth's reign. You see more of this type of blackwork. So this is not the geometric counted stitch that I associate with Holbein stitch. However, saying that, this is still blackwork embroidery. This is still blackwork embroidery on a Holbein portrait, so I guess you could still consider it Holbein stitch, even though it's not the counted geometric stitch. This is Elizabeth Lady Audley from about 1538. This is another portrait that is very small in diameter. It's 5.5 centimeters in diameter, but again, Holbein was very intricate in the detail work. We can zoom in and see what the blackwork embroidery pattern was on the edge of her dress right along the bust. This is Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk from about 1539, and if we zoom in on the collar, you can see there is blackwork embroidery. I have recreated the pattern here on the bottom right. And from the Textile Research Center, the sitter is wearing a shirt collar with a broad band of knotwork embroidered in blackwork. Here is a portrait of a lady, and depending on what website you look at, the museum says perhaps Catherine Howard. Some websites might actually list this as being Anne of Cleves rather than Catherine Howard. The difference being Anne of Cleves was wife number 4 for Henry VIII, and Catherine Howard was wife number 5 of Henry VIII. This says it's about 1540, and both of them, Anne of Cleves was only married to Henry VIII for about 6 months, and then they divorced, and then he married Catherine Howard, so that's where artists normally, or museums normally, or websites normally pick Catherine Howard for this. However, a neat thing to know about Holbein is with a lot of these miniature portraits that he did, he would do them on the back of playing cards. And a lot of times he liked to put Easter eggs in his portraits. Specifically, if you look at the portrait known as the Ambassadors, that one is very filled with all sorts of little things that if you look at the detail work between the skull and then the cross hiding behind the curtain in the top left corner, there are a lot of little things in there that Holbein is portraying more of a story to you rather than just simply the two men in the portrait. So as far as this portrait with the portrait of a lady, the reason why some believe that this might be Anne of Cleves is because Holbein painted this on the 4 of diamonds. And at the time, during the Tudor period, diamonds signified wealth. And so if she was the 4 of diamonds, the 4th wife of Henry VIII, diamonds being wealth, Henry VIII was very wealthy because at this time he had pretty much obliterated the Catholic Church within England, had closed down the monasteries, took all of the money, profited from it, and so he is a very rich man. She is the 4th wife, so the 4 of diamonds. Personally, I think there is conclusive evidence that this might be Anne of Cleves. However, the museum still has it listed as perhaps Catherine Howard. Either way, if you zoom in on the cuffs, right around her hands, you'll see that there is blackwork there on the cuffs. However, unlike his other portraits, Hans Holbein did not go into great detail with the cuffs here, but that might also be iconic because Anne of Cleves was only married to Henry VIII for 6 months and then they divorced, or even with Catherine Howard, if this is Catherine Howard, Again, they were only married for, I believe it was about 18 months. So either way, maybe it wasn't worth the time and effort to put all the detail work into the cuffs, because either way, the lady was already out the door. Just my opinion. This is a portrait of a young woman from about 1540 to 1545. And if you zoom in on her cuffs, you can see blackwork embroidery with, it looks like gold work in between the blackwork. Here I have recreated the blackwork pattern, which looks sort of like a twisted diamond pattern. This is a portrait at the National Portrait Gallery in London, labeled as an unknown woman from about 1540 to 1541. Some websites, if you look it up, associate this portrait with being Catherine Parr, who was the sixth wife of Henry VIII, but there's nothing confirming that. But if you zoom in closely on the cuffs, you can see where this is more iconic of the later 16th century blackwork, where it has more of that swirly floral free stitch rather than the counted stitch of blackwork. Here's the interesting thing. Does this portrait look familiar? This is Portrait of a Lady from about 1535 to 1540, and this particular portrait is at the Toledo Museum of Art. Both portraits are of the same woman. Both portraits were painted by Hans Holbein, but there are very tiny differences. Mostly, I think it's the color, maybe how it was restored. Either way, you zoom in on the cuffs and you can see that the cuffs still have that swirly floral pattern, which became more iconic with blackwork in the later 16th century. This is a portrait of a young merchant from about 1541. And once again, zoom in on the collar around his neck, and you can see that there is black embroidery on his neck. This is Lady Margaret Bacon Butts from about 1541 to 1543. If you zoom in on her collar, you can also see that there is blackwork embroidery there. However, due to how the collar is sitting, we can't see what the full pattern is, so I've only interpreted part of the pattern that I can see. This portrait is of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, from roughly 1541 to 1543, and if we zoom in on both the collar and the cuffs, we can see that there is black embroidery there. Once again, this is not the geometric embroidery that Holbein is attributed with, but it is black embroidery on a Holbein painting, so I guess you could still consider it Holbein stitch. Either way, there is blackwork embroidery on a Holbein painting. This is a drawing of Holbein's. This is an unidentified woman from about 1532 to 1543. We can zoom in on the collar and we can see that there is embroidery there. It is most likely blackwork embroidery that is there. There is another artist who recreated this pattern or this portrait and added more detail work so we know more of what the pattern looks like. But that artist is from, I believe, the later part of the 16th century. The main reason why, even from this drawing, I could try to recreate the pattern. In fact, I started to recreate the pattern, but to me, when I look at it, it reminds me too much of a swastika, and so it just made me cringe and I wanted to stop it. It looks like it could just be like a lattice pattern, like a spiraling lattice type pattern, but just from what's there, I chose not to recreate this pattern. And this is a portrait of an unidentified woman, and this one is also from about 1532 to 1543. Once again, it's a drawing of Holbein's and not a complete portrait. But if we zoom in on her collar, once again, we can see that there is detail work that is indicative of there being embroidery there, so most likely it is blackwork embroidery that is on her collar. So as far as recreating Holbein stitches, I have put some of these patterns on some of my previous projects. Like, remember the boy with the marmoset? Well, this is a partlet I had made years ago, and it has that same kind of ocean wave that is found on the boy's collar. And once again, the boy with the marmoset, I used that pattern and then I incorporated it into a combination of a few other patterns to create my own pattern. And so for another partlet, I combined the patterns found on the collar of James Stewart, who was the Earl of Moray, and the collar of the Portrait of a Boy with a Marmoset, and I added my own little flair to the center of each stem, keeping with the historical blackwork design. And remember Jane Seymour's cuffs? Well, from that I took the part of the pattern, and then instead of having the full pattern, I took out the little ocean wave part, and I changed up from crosses to diamonds, and then the center part I only had one strip rather than the reflective strip on there. So I condensed the pattern and then changed it from crosses to diamonds. But here are cuffs that I made for a boy's shirt using the pattern that I found on Jane Seymour's cuff and then creating my own pattern. Here's my works cited page. And the works cited page continued. And the works cited page continued. Thank you for checking out my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video and would like to watch more of my videos, please follow the links on the side of the page. Please select thumbs up that you like the video. It helps with the algorithm. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below. And please click subscribe and ring the bell to be updated when new videos come out.